We're often told that America is deeply divided, that polarization makes it impossible for us to make any progress in policy, that our country is so internally conflicted it cannot project unity and strength to the world. But on the most important foreign policy issue confronting policymakers, the problem is closer to the opposite. Washington has embraced a wide-ranging consensus on China that has turned into a classic example of groupthink. To watch Tuesday's hearing, held by the new House Select Committee on China, was to be transported back to the 1950s. Members of both parties tried to outdo each other in their denunciations of China, describing, as committee chair Mike Gallagher did, the Communist Party as an existential threat to the United States, and blaming it directly for every problem in America, from drug use to COVID to unemployment. An odd charge since unemployment is currently at a more than 50-year low. One could dismiss some of this more extreme rhetoric as the usual congressional grandstanding, but it creates a dynamic that makes rational policy difficult. Consider what happened a few weeks ago. The President of the United States, in what can only be described as a panic, ordered the U.S. military to shoot down 3 balloons that were probably private weather balloons similar to hundreds of such objects in the sky around the world that pose no threat to anyone. The sorts of balloons used by hobbyists and meteorological clubs can cost as little as $12. The missiles used to shoot down the recent offending objects cost over $400,000 each. The shoot-downs were ordered, of course, so that no one could claim that Joe Biden was soft on China. China is a serious strategic competitor, the most significant great power challenger that the United States has faced in many decades. That is all the more reason for Washington to shape a rational and considered foreign policy toward it, rather than one forged out of paranoia, hysteria, and above all, fears of being branded as soft. Whenever policy is made in those latter circumstances, think of Vietnam or Iraq, it turns out badly. In 2003, when Senate Minority Leader Tom Daschle tried to make the case for more diplomacy before going to war with Iraq, Republican Speaker Dennis Hastert suggested he was giving comfort to the enemy. The Select Committee on China spoke of those who dared to suggest improving relations with Beijing in similar terms. 6 years ago, before Donald Trump came into power, one would have described the U.S.-China relationship as difficult, perhaps even strained, and yet manageable, with regular dialogue between the two nations at the highest levels. When Washington confronted China on certain issues, such as currency manipulation, economic espionage, Beijing would make some effort to address the charges. Today, U.S.-China relations are a mess. China continues to do things that alarm Washington, but there's no discussion between the two sides. Beijing is actively supporting Russia economically and diplomatically in its war on Ukraine. Were that support to expand to include military assistance, Russia would gain an almost unlimited supply of armaments, transforming the war. Nancy Pelosi's August 2022 visit to Taiwan gave the People's Liberation Army a golden opportunity to practice a multi-day-long blockade of the island, their most likely military intervention in the event of a crisis. Were Kevin McCarthy to visit Taiwan, the PLA would likely use it as a pretext to practice a longer and more complete cutoff strategy, showing Taiwan that it could be isolated at will. Most troubling of all, China has embarked on a serious program of nuclear modernization. For decades, Beijing took the position that its small nuclear arsenal, hovering at just over 200 warheads, was an adequate deterrent. The Chinese also routinely affirmed their no first-use doctrine. Today, Beijing's warhead stockpile is estimated to be at over 400, and China is on a path to more than triple that. Meanwhile, Russia has practically abandoned all nuclear arms control talks and treaties with the U.S. As I've noted before, we face a new nuclear age in which 2 of the 3 largest arsenals on the planet are closely allied, with their missiles likely targeting the United States. How much of this was inevitable? It's hard to say. China has grown in power mightily since 2000. Back then, it accounted for almost 4% of global GDP. Today, that figure is about 18%. Its military expenditure has grown even faster. Xi Jinping is a far more aggressive leader than his predecessors. But it is also true that US policy has changed. Today we have a strong bipartisan view of the allegedly existential danger posed by the Chinese Communist Party, which implies that regime change would be the only solution to this problem. But has this comfortable consensus created a more secure world for Americans and others? Or are we moving down a path that takes us towards decades of arms races, crises, perhaps even war? Go to cnn.com/Fareed for a link to my Washington Post column this week, and let's get started. Days after the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz traveled to Washington to meet with President Biden. The war and its ripple effects were topics 1, 2, and 3 on the agenda the White House publicly announced. Right after he left the White House, Chancellor Scholz agreed to sit down for an exclusive interview with me. Chancellor Scholz, pleasure to have you on, sir.
Thank you for having me.
So the leader of the German opposition, Friedrich Merz, says today, why is Olaf Scholz in Washington? What is he doing there? I thought I'd give you a chance to respond to him.
I already told the Parliament what I'm doing here. I'm talking to the President, and this is not the first talk. I was here 1 year ago, but we met quite often, and we have a lot of phone calls, video conferences where we speak together. So this is part of a permanent dialogue of the two nations, of the President and me, and it's also a sign of a very good friendship and cooperation of the two countries.
How does Joe Biden strike you as a leader? You've met many leaders all over the world. What strikes you about Biden?
He is very informed about international relations. I think he's one of the most skilled presidents, knowing how things are running in the world, which is important in times that are becoming more dangerous and will see a lot of changes. And he is really a good man looking at the transatlantic partnership, which is so important for Europe, but also for peace of the world and for NATO. And I think there is something which we have in common, looking at the people you in the United States call the middle class. And I think it is important that we don't forget about their perspectives and their lives and their hopes. And so I like him.
When you were talking to President Biden, you must have confronted the reality that the war in Ukraine does appear to have settled into something of a stalemate. Neither side is making major advances. The Russians seem to have made some advances. Where does it go from here?
Looking at the situation, which looks like what you explained to us, we have to understand where we are coming from. So it was the idea of Russia that they will conquer the whole country in a very short time, and they did not succeed. They had to regroup their troops back from Kiev, where they started their invasion. Now they are doing this very ugly, aggressive war in the east of Ukraine. And Russia never expected the strength of Ukraine, of the people, the braveness, how they defend their country. And he never expected that they are what he is not accepting, a nation, and altogether. And on the other hand, he misjudged the unity of Europe, of the United States, and all the friends of Ukraine, and the permanent supply of weapons we give to the Ukraine. And so they were able to defend their country, and they will be able to do it in the future. It is very difficult to judge what will be the next things to happen in Ukraine, but there is something which is absolutely clear. We will continue to support Ukraine with financial, humanitarian aid, but also with weapons.
But if this continues for years, Ukraine as a country will be destroyed. Its economy is already down 40-50%, depending on what estimate you look at. Is there a point at which you have to start negotiations, and is there a deal to be had where, Ukraine gets some kind of security guarantees from NATO, perhaps EU membership, and in return it accepts the reality that it is not getting Crimea back, it is perhaps not getting some parts of the Donbass back?
There will be no decisions without the Ukrainians. We will not take decisions instead of them. We support them.
But should they? Would you encourage them to take these decisions?
So we told them that they can go for membership in the European Union, and they are working to make progress in all the criteria that are important for this. I think they know that we are ready to organize a certain way of security guarantee for the country in times of peace to come, but we are not there yet. And to my view, it is necessary that Putin understands that he will not succeed with his invasion and his imperialistic aggression, and that he has to withdraw troops. This is the basis for talks. And if you look at the proposals of the Ukrainians, it's easy to understand they are ready for peace, but there must be something done, and this has to be done by Putin.
Chancellor Scholz, let me ask you about your extraordinary speech to the German Bundestag, where you talked about a kind of revolution, a turning of German foreign policy. Whole world looked at it and was struck by what an extraordinary statement it was. But the action has not really followed. You talked about $100 billion that was going to be spent, an increase in defense spending. I think something like $8 billion is going to be spent this year. Is there, what is stopping you from making your actions match your words?
First, I announced that we will supply weapons to Ukraine and give all the necessary financial aid, and we are now the strongest supporter of Ukraine in continental Europe, and we will continue to be. It is 14 billion euros which we spent in the one or the other way to support Ukraine the last year. And this is also due to weapons, where we are acting together with the United States and other friends and delivering a lot of very successful weapons for the defense of Ukraine. The last decision was about combat tanks together with the United States, but it was the same when we discussed about multi-rocket launchers, for instance, and similar weapons necessary for Ukraine. So we delivered in this case. And the second is that we made us independent from the supply of gas, coal, and oil from Russia. No one really expected 1 year ago that we would easily economically survive a situation where there is no gas supply to Germany and many parts of Europe from Russia anymore. But we did in increasing the capacity of LNG imports from the western ports of Europe, and also building new ports in the northern shores of Germany, using for a longer time as we planned coal plants, also using nuclear plants which were running out, but we increased the possibility for them to produce electricity. And so we made it, and nothing of what some people expected happened. There is no economic crisis in Germany. There is no gas shortage or something like that. And
all the more reason to spend more money on defense now.
And there is also social stability. Yes, we spent altogether 300 billion to stabilize our economy and save the pockets of the normal people, that they can survive a situation of increasing prices and increased prices for energy, which we are seeing that they are going down again. And also we started with investing more in our defense, and it is absolutely clear that we will go to 2% of our GDP as is agreed in NATO.
When?
We are starting with this, and we are not spending 8 billion. We are spending quite a lot because we already have the highest defense budget in the European Union, to be very clear, as Germany. But we are willing to increase this. But it is not that we are going to a shopping mall and saying, I would to buy this or this. And it is even different as if we would buy some cars or trucks, which you can ask companies to do, and you will have them right the next day or in 2 or 3 or 6 months' time. in many cases, we have to make the industry starting their production and delivering this to us. And this is the idea behind this 100 billion fund, which was agreed by the parliament with a 2/3 majority, that we can take now the decisions that are necessary for the long-term supply of our army. And this will be about tanks, and it will be about air defense, and it will be about munition. And my idea is that we have to change the way how we are dealing with the defense industry. So we need, and this is also a lesson we learn now from Ukraine and the war the Russians started against Ukraine, we need a permanent supply. So the main weapons we use should be produced permanently. This is also for all the necessary maintenance, and this is also for munition. If we do so, this will increase our capability, but it will increase also the security, because as we see in a difficult situation, we must be able to increase the production. So it is easier to increase a production that is already ongoing as to start newly, because this will happen 2 or 3 years later. And this is also the answer. When we, in this year, will make all the agreements with the defense industry about the things they will deliver to us, we will not get them the next day. It will, and sometimes, take some years. Even the F-35 we are buying in the United States will be not coming to Germany just the next day.
More in a moment with Chancellor Scholz, including China, which the White House signaled would be on President Biden's agenda with him. For the past 7 years, China has been Germany's top trading partner. There was more than $300 billion in trade between the two nations last year, according to Reuters. Germany's own finance minister suggested the strength of the relationship may actually be dangerous, saying that his country should learn from what has transpired with Russia. I asked the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, about Berlin-Beijing relations as part of my exclusive interview. Chancellor, I want to ask you about China. The European Union, Europe, has been very closely allied with America and its position on Russia. Do you, in Germany, believe that you are in exactly the same place as the United States with regard to China policy?
We all are very clear there should be no circumventing of sanctions by China, and we are looking intensely that this is not happening. As far as we see, more or less they are not circumventing, but we will continue to look. And this is even more so that we ask them not to deliver weapons to Russia, and we are telling them in our bilateral talks, but also publicly, that they should not do.
And,
so we are aligned.
What do they say to you when you say that?
So publicly they said they will not deliver weapons. But it is just necessary to say what has to be said, and this is...
Could you imagine sanctioning China if they were to aid
I think
Russia?
It would have consequences, but we are now in a stage where we are making clear that this should not happen, and I'm relatively optimistic that we will be successful with our request in this case. But we will have to look at it, and we have to be very, very cautious. And let me just remind you that one thing happened when I went to China and spoke with Xi Jinping. He agreed that the two of us publicly say that the use of nuclear weapons should not happen in this war. And this made it also feasible that in the G20 meeting in Indonesia, on Bali, we were able to agree on a speech and a language where we say these weapons should not be used. And this is very helpful because it helps not to make it much more difficult to escalate the war to something like this. And if you hear all the words about nuclear weapons before and afterwards, it is really a change. So we have to be very clear with our position in this case, and we are all together. And we have to work intensely that we have a lot of countries supporting a world which is not revisionist, which is not which is accepting borders. This is the real change coming from the Russian war, and it's not just a European question, it's a question for the whole world, that Russia is not accepting agreements that had been made with the United Nations, had been made in the Conference on Security and Peace in Europe and other activities we had in the past, that there should be no change of borders by force. And when I discuss to countries in Asia or Africa or the South of America, I think that many agree to that. And we see it in the decisions of the General Assembly. Many agree to this view, even if they do not vote in favor of this voting of the Assembly. But they understand that this is a threat also to them. And if we continuously talk to our friends over there, I think it will be helpful for forming a world that is multipolar, but a better world and not more dangerous.
Xi Jinping says Vladimir Putin is his best friend. He said that many times. Is it your sense there's a personal bond between the two of them?